I recently compared a mini LED with an OLED ultrawide, and you guys seem to be pretty interested about it. So what about when it comes to high refresh rate mini LED monitors? Does it make any sense for competitive gamers? Well, today we're looking at the AOC Agon Pro AG274QZM. It features a 1440p 240Hz IPS panel with, of course, mini LED structure, has HDR1000 certification and also G-Sync compatibility. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for a whopping £1,000, while in the US it can be found for $1,000. So is it actually worth its price tag, and how does it compare to other high refresh rate monitors out there on the market? Let's find out. So jumping straight in, let's talk about this monitor's input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at just 0.6 milliseconds, making it among one of the fastest monitors that I've tested to date. Indeed, over here, when the low input lag mode is enabled, you'll actually get a phenomenal experience. Now, it's worth noting there is no inherent disadvantages of having it permanently enabled, and I'm not really sure why the manufacturer gives you the option of enabling or disabling low input lag mode through the monitor's OSD. Now, in terms of my own subjective opinion, I did feel that it backed up my own objective claims. In other words, the monitor did respond extremely well to my mouse input while playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Now, while that's all very impressive, the same couldn't be said about its response time. See here, while playing a hardcore competitive game, I just felt that it was a bit too sluggish. It didn't really respond all that well to different scenes. And in this respect, it really cannot keep up with any sort of OLEDs or indeed some modern LCD panels that run at a higher refresh rate. My go-to and my personal favorite, for example, is the AOC Agon Pro AG274QS, a 300Hz IPS monitor that runs 1440p and completely demolishes this monitor when it comes to the overall response time. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is this monitor's response time wasn't tuned for hardcore gaming. Now, furthermore, I did find it really odd that I was not able to get any sort of measurements from this monitor. In other words, when it comes to its response time, I usually use the OSRTD tool. And here, when I did launch up the program, it straight away came up with an error telling me that there was some sort of strobing occurring. Now, nonetheless, I'd seen this behavior before with other AOC monitors using mini LED structures, so I ran the test and lo and behold, there was a lot of odd things going on. As you'll be able to see over here, this graph is supposed to look like relatively smooth, but instead you're getting massive peaks all over the place, suggesting to me that something odd is going on, almost like where you were to enable MBR. This is motion blur reduction, just in case you're wondering, and this is not present on this monitor, and yet the behavior that it's showing seems to lead that way. On that note over here, MBR is completely omitted, so therefore if you do want to reduce the motion blur, there's actually no means of doing it on this monitor. Now, on the plus side, the overall motion clarity of this monitor, even without its MBR mode, is actually pretty impressive. Furthermore, there's very little inverse ghosting present even on its strongest mode overdrive, as you'll be hopefully able to see over here via the UFO ghosting test. Now, accepting the fact that this monitor is not really aimed at hardcore competitive gamers, at least not in my opinion due to its overall response time performance, I went ahead and played some more casual games. Now, this gave me the opportunity to test its adaptive sync technologies. And here I've got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort or HDMI, I was able to run the Nvidia G-Sync pendulum demo and didn't incur any sort of black screen issues or flickering. Now, indeed, this monitor will run the technology over HDMI because it has two HDMI 2.1 ports with VR support, which is seriously impressive and quite a novelty. Now, past that, I was able to run over HDMI or DisplayPort, HDR, G-Sync, 1440p at 240Hz without any problems either. So indeed, all these technologies work simultaneously without any sort of problems, and when playing a game like Destiny 2, it did give me a fantastic tear-free gaming experience. Now, it's worth pointing out this monitor is not a G-Sync module monitor, but rather G-Sync compatible, and therefore its overall VRR range is less impressive than a G-Sync module monitor because it doesn't have the full 1 to 240Hz. Rather, it goes from 48Hz up to 240Hz, which is still pretty impressive, but just something I thought to highlight and not to be confused about when you're looking at this monitor and potentially comparing it with some of the alternatives. Now, arguably one of the biggest selling points of this monitor is its HDR performance, and indeed it has VISA's Display HDR1000 certification, and for good reason. It does get very bright, and it's got 576 local dimming zones, which is impressive, although not class leading in comparison to some other mini LED monitors out there, which are a little bit more expensive, because they have over 1000 local dimming zones, therefore giving you an even superior experience, let alone OLEDs, which actually have the ability to switch on and off independent pixels, and therefore giving you an even more lifelike experience. Nonetheless, over here I had no complaints when it came to its overall HDR experience, and I was very much impressed with what AOC had managed over here. Furthermore, the overall color accuracy in HDR did also look the part. Now, I would also like to point out that local dimming can be switched on and off both in HDR and also SDR. Now, I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to do it in the former, but in the latter, I did actually find a few different odd behaviors. See here, normally when you enable local dimming in SDR, it will give you a completely pitch black image, but that wasn't quite the case with this monitor. In fact, local dimming just seemed to be a little bit hit and miss in SDR, but none such issues were there when I was running HDR. So just some food for thought, specifically when you're comparing and contrasting with this monitor and some of its competitors, because I hadn't experienced this sort of behavior ever before. Now, moving past all of this, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. And given this has two HDMI 2.1 ports, you shouldn't have any sort of issue running 1440p at 120Hz. In fact, via the monitor's OSD, you've even got a HDMI toggle, where you can flip between 240 or 120Hz. Now, furthermore, I was able to run my 4K Blu-ray player with this monitor, and I can confirm that it does accept a 4K signal input, which means that it has got good sort of versatility, be it if you're using it with a console or indeed a computer. So moving on from its gaming performance, how does the monitor actually look like? Well, it's got a flat 27-inch IPS panel with that mini LED structure, runs 1440p at 240Hz, and has also got a matte coating to it. Now, 3D Monitor's OSD, you have got a dedicated sRGB mode, although it's a shame over here to see that brightness is locked. Now, nonetheless, in said mode, I was able to run it through my calibrators and notice a gamut coverage of 90.9% in sRGB and a gamut volume of 95.4%. Below, you can see how it compares to the sRGB standard, and as for the average LTE, it sat at a very impressive 1.49 and a maximum of 2.66. Indeed, this monitor can be used for any sort of video grading work or serious image editing work. Now, as for its tested contrast ratio, bearing in mind this was in SDR with local dimming disabled, it was sitting at 1036:1, which is a little bit subpar for an IPS panel. As for its measured white point, however, it's pretty much pinpoint accurate at 6658 Kelvin at 100% in comparison to the 6500 Kelvin target. Now, as for its gamma curve, it sits very close to the 2.2 standard, further showcasing that this monitor is very impressive, at least in its sRGB mode. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of image editing work, you'll probably want to go on one of the other color modes, purely because it unlocks the wider color gamut of this monitor and makes the image pop a little bit more. Now, in its warp mode preset, I had the sRGB, DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB positively affected. As you can see over here, it's a lot wider in comparison to what we had before. Now, below you can see how it compares to the Adobe RGB standard, not to be confused with what I just referenced before with the sRGB standard. However, it's not exactly color accurate in the Adobe RGB gamut because the average LTE sat at 2.86 and a maximum of 7.34. As for its measured white point, it does shift very slightly, but it's still impressive at 6713 Kelvin at 100%, and equally, its gamma curve still sits pretty close to the 2.2 standards. Now, aside from color performance, what about when it comes to the overall brightness? Well, yes indeed, over here it does get very bright, where in HDR I recorded a peak of 1230 nits. In SDR it's still very impressive, be it with or without local dimming, at a maximum of 558 nits. It does get all the way down to 70 nits as well, showing decent range. However, it is a shame to see that the sRGB mode has a locked brightness, and this sits at 278 nits. Now, what is really poor, however, is its overall brightness uniformity. And indeed, over here you'll be able to see that there's quite a bit of orange and red on your screen, which is not something that I would come to expect for a monitor of its price point. I do appreciate this is somewhat panelottery, but it's something I thought to highlight. Now, equally, the overall backlight bleed isn't exactly the best, With that said, it's pretty much a common occurrence with IPS panels, and in this respect, the pictures that you can see are in SDR with local dimming disabled. Now, I did point out before that if you were to enable local dimming in SDR, it doesn't seem to do much of a job, and indeed over here you can see that it should be completely pitch black. Just for a complete contrast, you'll be able to see over here the image in HDR with local dimming enabled, and yes indeed, it's completely pitch black. This is what I would come to expect with an SDR image as well, with local dimming on, but alas, that wasn't the case. Now, moving on from these tests, I would just like to have a quick word about its build quality. And here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. Now, the stand itself is actually very sturdy and provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore great for ergonomics. However, the stand itself is oversized and it doesn't really actually fit on my monitor riser, which is quite a shame. Thankfully, however, the monitor stand can actually be replaced altogether because you've got VESA compatibility. Therefore, you can mount it on a monitor arm or indeed purchase a third-party monitor stand, which will potentially fit with your setup a little bit better. Now here, the monitor stand has also got a logo projection, which could in part be due to the reason why it's a bit oversized. I don't really see the point of this, and equally I don't really see the point of RGB lights, which don't really serve a purpose. The RGB lights are positioned at the rear of the monitor and underneath it. Again, I don't really see why they are actually included, but it seems to be a somewhat nonsensical trend by a lot of manufacturers. Now, should you want to play around with those RGB lights or indeed customize the logo projection, you can do so through the monitor's OSD. And here it can be accessed via the joystick button found behind the monitor, or better still, the included puck, which is very intuitive to use on a day-to-day basis. Now, through the monitor's OSD, you might have also noticed that there's an audio setting. And here it's because it has two 5-watt speakers with DTS. Now, indeed over here, the sound is actually pretty impressive. However, I would always recommend a set of bookshelf speakers, a headphone, or indeed a DAC in order to get a far superior audio experience. On that note, if you do want to plug in your wired headphones directly into the monitor, you can do so because it's got a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now elsewhere, I would also like to mention that this monitor has got USB Type-C input, which also delivers up to 65 watts of power, making it quite handy for those who are doing sort of productivity work or indeed just plugging in a laptop directly into this monitor. Furthermore, the monitor also has a built-in KVM switch. You can find out some more information about this up on your pop-up banner or down in the description below, but effectively means that if you do connect up your computer via DisplayPort or HDMI, then furthermore connect up the laptop via USB Type-C to the monitor, and then finally connect up the mouse and keyboard directly into the monitor, you can effectively switch between the two sources without having to plug and unplug your peripherals every single time. Now, to round off the overall build quality of this monitor, I would also like to mention that there's some shader hoods. It's not something that I actually like using myself, but it can be useful in certain scenarios, specifically if you just want to be concentrating on the monitor itself and therefore zoning in to the content that you're consuming. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict. And quite frankly, I don't personally see the point of a high refresh rate mini LED monitor, purely because it should be appealing to competitive gamers, but the overall response time and the experience that one can get from it is actually subpar. Now granted, there'll be a niche for it. For those people who want a monitor which is good for productivity, therefore you're not going to get any sort of that fringing effect with an OLED, and also none of the sort of burn-in and sort of maintenance that you have to worry about. And equally for those people who want that phenomenal HDR experience without having to go for an ultrawide, therefore a 27-inch form factor. If you do fall in that rather niche category, at least in my opinion, then arguably this is a great monitor. But then it also does come in at a very steep price point. Here you can buy a very competent OLED, or you can buy yourself a regular IPS monitor, which won't give you the same sort of HDR experience, but will otherwise be an absolutely phenomenal monitor for your day-to-day usage, or for example, if you're a hardcore gamer. Now, some of the monitors that I would recommend, including from the likes of AOC themselves, will be down in the description below. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of high refresh rate mini LED monitors down in the comment section below, and if you think this monitor is actually worth its price tag. Now, if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. And as such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.